The stale air in the corner market hung thick with the scent of cheap disinfectant and wilting produce. It was a smell Eleanor Vance knew well, a scent that clung to the bottom rung of hope. Outside, a perpetual gray sky pressed down on the cracked pavement of the neighborhood, a lid on a pot of quiet desperation. Her wheelchair, a standard-issue manual model with a persistent squeak in the left wheel, felt cumbersome in the narrow aisle. Her gnarled fingers, twisted by arthritis into a permanent, painful clench, struggled to grip the push rims. Each rotation was a small, gritty victory against the betrayal of her own body. She was reaching for the last can of tomato soup on the shelf, the cheap brand, the one that tasted more of tin than tomato, when the world fractured. Move it! The voice was a serrated edge, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerated coolers. Eleanor flinched, her hand hovering in midair. Rick stood behind her, his bulk filling the aisle. He was a man whose presence was an occupation. All cheap cologne, sour breath, and simmering resentment. His face was a fleshy map of grievances, his eyes small and mean. He was angry at the world, and today, Eleanor's squeaking wheelchair was the focal point of that boundless rage. She tried to maneuver the chair, to reverse it out of his path, but the wheel caught on a loose tile. A small, involuntary sound of frustration, a soft tsk, escaped her lips. It was barely audible, a whisper of a sound, but for Rick, it was a spark on a short fuse. He slammed his fist against a metal shelf stacked with boxes of cereal, making them rattle. The teenage cashier at the front, a boy named Kevin with acne and a perpetual look of fear, jumped. Two other customers, a young couple near the dairy case, froze and pretended to be intensely interested in the expiration date on a carton of milk. Rick leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to Eleanor's. The smell of stale beer and sweat washed over her. "Did you say something to me?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. Eleanor remained silent, her gaze fixed on the dented can of soup. She had learned long ago that silence was a shield. To engage was to offer a purchase for their hatred, a hook upon which they could hang their own failures. Her silence, however, only seemed to enrage him further. It was a denial of his power, an act of defiance he could not tolerate. "I'm talking to you, you old cripple," he spat, the words slick with contempt. He jabbed a thick finger toward her face. "You think you're better than me? Sitting there in your pity chair." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. But her expression remained a placid mask. She had faced men who held the power of life and death in their hands. She had looked into the eyes of true monsters under a blistering foreign sun. This man, this pathetic bully in a dingy market, was nothing more than a shadow, a loud noise signifying his own emptiness. But the emptiness was dangerous. It demanded to be filled with the fear of others. "Answer me when I'm talking to you," he roared, his voice echoing in the small, suddenly silent store. The young couple now stared openly, their faces pale. Kevin the cashier looked like he might bolt. And then came the words that would hang in the air like poison gas, the words that would change everything. He straightened up, puffing out his chest, performing for his captive audience of the terrified and the timid. "Shut up, you bitch." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She hadn't spoken a word. The insult was not a response. It was a pure, unadulterated act of malice, aimed at the easiest target he could find. It was designed to shatter her, to reduce her to a weeping, broken thing he could step over. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The silence of a community holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse of a woman they saw only as fragile. They saw the wheelchair, the gray hair, the worn coat. They did not see the steel in her spine. Rick smirked, satisfied with the shockwave his cruelty had produced. He saw her as an object, a prop in the drama of his own inflated ego. To him, her worth was less than the loose tile that had snagged her wheel. He nudged her chair with the toe of his boot, a small, demeaning gesture of dominance. "Got nothing to say now, do you?" Useless old hag. He reveled in the palpable fear he had created, mistaking it for respect. The other shoppers, the silent witnesses, became his accomplices through their inaction. Their averted eyes and tight-lipped paralysis validated his power, confirming his belief that the strong could feast on the weak without consequence. The world, in his view, was a simple food chain, and he was, for this brief, ugly moment, at the very top. Eleanor felt the slight jolt of his boot against her frame. It was a violation, a crossing of a line that was both physical and profoundly spiritual. He was not just pushing a piece of medical equipment. He was pushing at the very edges of her dignity. The conflict was no longer just about a blocked aisle. It was a siege upon her personhood. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of dust and decay. Her hands, resting in her lap, curled into tight fists, the knuckles white. She would not give him the satisfaction of a tear, nor the ammunition of a retort. Her stillness became her weapon. The young couple by the dairy case began to move, their shopping forgotten. The woman whispered something to the man, her eyes wide with a mixture of pity for Eleanor and fear of Rick. The man shook his head, a gesture of helpless resignation, and guided her toward the front of the store, their footsteps shamefully quiet. They paid for their milk in cash, avoiding eye contact with Kevin, who fumbled with the change, his hands trembling. They were escaping, leaving Eleanor to her fate, and their departure left a vacuum in the store, making the confrontation feel even more isolated and stark. Rick noticed their retreat and his chest swelled with a renewed sense of command. "Yeah, that's right," he muttered, loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "Nobody wants to get involved. Nobody cares about a washed-up old wreck like you." He paced the small space in front of her, a caged animal proud of its cage. "What do you even do all day? Just roll around, collecting handouts, getting in everyone's way." Each word was a carefully chosen stone, intended to chip away at her composure. He wanted a reaction. He needed to see her break to confirm his own superiority. Her silence was a mirror he did not want to look into, reflecting his own ugliness back at him. So he escalated. "Look at you," he sneered, gesturing with a contemptuous wave of his hand. "Probably never worked a day in your life. Just another parasite sucking the life out of this neighborhood." The irony was a bitter pill in Eleanor's throat. The life she had lived, the sacrifices she had made, were so far beyond this man's comprehension that they might as well have happened on another planet. The weight of her past pressed down on her, not as a burden, but as an anchor in the turbulent storm of his abuse. The world of the market faded, the harsh fluorescent lights blurring at the edges of her vision. The smell of disinfectant was replaced by the acrid scent of cordite and the metallic tang of blood. She was no longer in aisle 3, but in a dusty, sun-scorched alley in Fallujah. The memory was so vivid it was almost a physical transport. She saw the face of a young Marine, barely 19, his eyes wide with shock and pain, his life pouring out into the sand. She remembered the desperate pressure of her hands on the wound, the shouted commands, the roar of a nearby explosion that had deafened her for a week. She remembered the weight of his body as he went limp, the final rattling breath. His name was Corporal Miller. He had a picture of his baby girl taped to the inside of his helmet. Then, another memory surfaced, softer but no less potent. The rumble of a Harley-Davidson panhead, the one her husband, Thomas, had built from scratch in their garage. The feel of his leather jacket against her cheek as she held on tight, the wind whipping through her hair. Thomas, a sergeant major with a chest full of ribbons and a heart full of unwavering principle. He was a man who spoke little but whose actions were sermons. "Dignity, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low gravel. "It's the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it to them." He had been the bedrock of her life, a mountain of integrity. He rode with a club, men who looked like monsters to the outside world, but who lived by a code of honor stricter than any law. They were his brothers, and by extension they had been hers. The IED had taken Thomas instantly. Months later, on a different patrol, another one had taken her legs. She remembered the searing white flash, the feeling of being lifted and torn apart, and then a profound, terrifying silence before the pain crashed in. She had woken up in a hospital in Germany, a ghost in a broken machine. The doctors told her she was lucky to be alive. Some days she wasn't so sure. She had fought her way back from that abyss, not with shouting or anger, but with a quiet, stubborn refusal to be extinguished. She had survived war, loss, and the kind of pain that rewrites a person's soul. She had survived things that would have turned Rick into a whimpering puddle on the floor. This man, this loud, empty man, was not a threat. He was a test of the promise she had made to Thomas's memory, to live with dignity, no matter the cost. Her focus returned to the present, to the grimy floor of the market. Rick was still ranting, his words now a meaningless drone in the background of her thoughts. The memories had fortified her, reminding her of who she was. She was not the frail, helpless creature he saw. She was Eleanor Vance, a widow, a veteran, a survivor, and she could not give him the satisfaction of her surrender. Her gaze shifted from the dented can of soup to Rick's bloated face, and for the first time, she truly saw him. A small, frightened man, terrified of his own insignificance. And in that moment, she felt not fear, but a deep, weary pity. The pressure in the small store became a physical force, thick and unbreathable. Rick, fueled by her continued silence, felt his frustration boiling over into a more volatile form of rage. Words were no longer enough. He needed a physical punctuation to his tirade of abuse. He needed to make his contempt tangible. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on the small, wire basket resting on Eleanor's lap. It contained only 2 items, a loaf of day-old bread and a small carton of milk. It was the entirety of her planned purchase, a meal of quiet humility. "You think you can just ignore me?" he bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "I'll give you something to pay attention to." With a sudden, violent motion, he kicked the front of her wheelchair. It wasn't a hard kick, not enough to tip her over, but it was jarring and deliberately cruel. The impact sent a painful shock up her spine. The wire basket jumped from her lap, and its meager contents tumbled onto the dirty linoleum floor. The carton of milk burst open upon impact, a splash of white spreading like a blooming, sterile flower. The loaf of bread rolled under a low shelf, coming to rest next to a dust bunny the size of a fist. A collective gasp came from the few remaining onlookers who had been frozen in morbid fascination. The sound of the milk carton splitting open was like a gunshot in the tense silence. It was an act of such petty, pointless cruelty that it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Eleanor stared at the white puddle spreading on the floor, at the lost loaf of bread. That was her dinner, perhaps her breakfast for the next day, too. A wave of cold, sharp despair washed over her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. It was the sheer waste of it, the casual destruction of something so small yet so vital. Rick let out a short, barking laugh. "Oops," he said, the word dripping with mock sympathy. "Looks like you spilled something. Better clean that up." He gestured vaguely at the mess on the floor, a king commanding a subject he knew to be powerless. The humiliation was absolute. She was trapped, unable to retrieve her food, unable to clean the mess, forced to sit in the wreckage of his temper. The store owner, Mr. Chan, a small, elderly man who usually remained hidden behind his counter, peeked over the top. His face was ashen, his eyes filled with a conflict of fear and outrage. He looked from Rick's triumphant sneer to Eleanor's still form, her back ramrod straight, her head held high even as she stared at her ruined meal. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Rick shot him a look, a silent, brutal warning that sent the old man shrinking back behind the shelter of his register. The silence of the community was no longer passive. It was a deafening roar of complicity. Their fear had made them prisoners, just as surely as Eleanor's chair had made her a target. They were all trapped in the aisle with her, their inaction a chain that bound them to her humiliation. Eleanor felt their eyes on her, their pity a fresh layer of salt on the wound. She didn't want their pity. She had never wanted it. Pity was a cage of its own. In the corner, near the front window, A young mother clutched her small son's hand. The boy, no older than 4, had started to whimper, frightened by the shouting and the sudden violence. His big, brown eyes were fixed on Eleanor, full of a child's pure, uncomplicated empathy. He saw not a cripple or an old woman, but a person who was being hurt. His mother tried to shush him, her own face a mask of anxiety as she tried to make them both invisible. The child's soft cries were the only sound that dared to challenge Rick's oppressive dominance. Eleanor heard him. Through the fog of her own silent struggle, the sound of the child's distress cut through. It was a sound she knew well from her time as a medic, the sound of innocence confronted with brutality. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. Her focus moved from her own loss, from the spilled milk and the lost bread, to the small, crying boy. Her training, her very nature, kicked in. Protect the vulnerable. That had always been the mission. With a slow, deliberate effort that cost her dearly in physical pain, she began to turn her wheelchair. The squeaking of the wheel was loud in the charged silence. She ignored the mess on the floor. She ignored Rick, who watched her with a puzzled, contemptuous frown, assuming she was trying to flee. But she wasn't retreating. She was advancing. Her target was the candy rack next to the checkout counter, a colorful display of cheap chocolates and sugary treats. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small, worn coin purse she kept in her coat pocket. The clasp was difficult, her stiff fingers fumbling with the metal. Finally, it popped open. Inside lay her entire fortune until her disability check would arrive at the end of the week. 3 crumpled $1 bills and a handful of coins. It was the money for the soup and bread, the money she no longer had a use for today. It was, in a very real sense, her last meal. She carefully picked out $1 and smoothed it on her lap. Her eyes scanned the rack, settling on a simple bar of milk chocolate. She wheeled herself to the counter, right past Rick, who stood dumbfounded by her audacity. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge his existence. He had been erased. She placed the $1 on the counter in front of the petrified cashier. "The chocolate bar, please, Kevin," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was as clear and steady as a bell. It was the first time she had spoken. The sound of her own voice, calm and controlled, was a balm to her frayed nerves. Kevin stared at her, then at the $1, then back at her, his mouth slightly agape. He fumbled for the candy bar and placed it in her outstretched hand. Eleanor took the chocolate and turned her chair away from the counter. She wheeled herself over to the young mother and her crying son. The mother shrank back slightly, terrified of being drawn into the conflict. Eleanor stopped a respectful distance away and held out the chocolate bar to the little boy. "It's okay, little one," she said, her voice gentle, infused with a warmth that seemed to push back the chill in the store. "There's no need for tears. Sometimes the world is loud, but there is still sweetness in it." The little boy looked from his mother to Eleanor, his crying subsiding into hiccuping sniffs. His small hand reached out and took the chocolate. He gave her a watery, hesitant smile. It was a small, simple act of kindness, of human connection in a moment of profound ugliness. It was a defiant declaration that his cruelty would not be the final word in this store, on this day. By choosing compassion over her own urgent need, by sacrificing her last $1 for a stranger's comfort, Eleanor Vance had just seized control of the narrative. She had taken his ugliest moment and transformed it into her most beautiful one. The act of giving, so pure and unexpected, hung in the air, fundamentally altering the store's emotional landscape. It was a quiet rebellion, more powerful than any shouted retort. Rick, who had been puffing his chest out, ready for the next round of his assault, seemed to deflate. His cruelty, which a moment before had felt like immense power, now looked childish and pathetic in the stark contrast of her grace. He had knocked over a woman's food. She had used her last $1 to comfort a frightened child. The moral imbalance was so stark, so undeniable, that it left him momentarily speechless, his mouth hanging open, his next insult dying on his lips. The onlookers, who had been paralyzed by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity, were visibly shaken from their stupor. The shame was a palpable wave that washed over them. The man who had pulled his wife back from the dairy case now stared at his own shoes, his face flushed with a deep, burning red. He had chosen self-preservation, while this woman, with so much less, had chosen selfless generosity. His cowardice was now laid bare for him to see. His wife looked at Eleanor, her eyes shining with unshed tears of admiration and guilt. Whispers began to ripple through the small audience. "My God!" A woman near the magazine rack breathed. "Did you see that?" Another man shook his head slowly, a look of dawning respect on his face. "Who is she?" He murmured to no one in particular. They were no longer seeing a frail victim in a wheelchair. The lens through which they viewed her had been irrevocably shattered. They were now seeing a woman of immense, almost incomprehensible strength. They saw the quiet dignity Thomas Vance had spoken of, and they felt humbled by it. Even Kevin, the young cashier, stood up a little straighter behind his counter. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something new: resolve. He looked at Rick, and for the first time, his gaze held not terror, but a nascent contempt. The power dynamic in the room had been completely upended, not by a threat of violence, but by a single quiet act of profound decency. It was into this charged, transformed silence that the first sound intruded. It began as a low, distant thrumming, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong to the neighborhood's usual soundtrack of sirens and tired cars with bad mufflers. It was a deeper, more guttural frequency, like the growl of a great beast waking from a long slumber. Heads turned toward the large plate glass window at the front of the market. The thrumming grew steadily, resolving itself into the unmistakable, syncopated rhythm of V-twin engines. Not one or two, but many. The sound swelled, a rolling wave of mechanical thunder that seemed to make the very air in the store vibrate. The cans on the shelves hummed with a sympathetic resonance. Then they came into view. The first motorcycle, a massive, gleaming black Harley, turned the corner onto the street, its chrome catching the weak afternoon light. It was followed by two more, then five, then a dozen. They kept coming, a seemingly endless river of steel, leather, and chrome, flooding the narrow street. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating grace, filling the road from curb to curb. They were Hell's Angels. Their cuts were adorned with the familiar, feared Death's head patch, along with rockers proclaiming their territory and club name. Their faces, framed by beards and weathered by wind and sun, were hard, impassive masks. They pulled up in front of the small market, a phalanx of silent, waiting power. One by one, they cut their engines, the individual roars dying down to be replaced by the ticking and cooling of hot metal. But they did not dismount. They simply sat, straddling their machines, a silent, watchful army. There had to be 100, maybe more. The sheer, overwhelming presence of them was a physical force, blocking out the light, their collective gaze seeming to focus on the small, insignificant drama playing out inside the store. The street, which had been empty moments before, was now occupied territory. The world outside the market had been annexed by a new, formidable power. The silence that fell after the last engine was cut was 100 times more menacing than the noise had been. It was a heavy, profound quiet, pregnant with unspoken threat. The air crackled with it. Inside the store, everyone was frozen, their attention riveted on the silent legion outside. Rick's face had gone from blotchy red to a pasty, sickly white. The swagger was gone, replaced by a primal, animal fear. He looked like a man who had just realized he had been shouting insults into the mouth of a volcano. The door of the lead bike, a custom chopper with impossibly long forks, opened with a deliberate slowness. The man who swung his leg over the saddle was a giant, built like a mountain with a long, braided gray beard that reached the top of his cut. Tattoos snaked up his neck and disappeared into his hairline. His eyes, set in a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun, had seen more than most people could imagine. His vest bore a patch that read President. This was the man in charge. He walked toward the entrance of the market, his boots heavy on the pavement. The bell above the door chimed, a ridiculously cheerful, incongruous sound in the face of such a grim entrance. The president, whose name was Preacher, stepped inside, his massive frame seeming to shrink the already small space. He didn't look at Rick. He didn't look at the other customers. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the interior until they found Eleanor. And then the impossible happened. The hardness in his face dissolved. The granite seemed to soften, the grim lines around his eyes easing into something that looked like profound, sorrowful respect. He moved past Rick as if the man were a piece of furniture, his focus entirely on the woman in the wheelchair. He stopped in front of her. The sheer size of him was overwhelming, but his posture was not threatening. It was protective. He slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee, a gesture of fealty that stunned every person watching. A giant of a man, the leader of a fearsome outlaw motorcycle club, was kneeling on the dirty floor of a corner market before a disabled widow. "Ellie," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was surprisingly gentle. "We got a call. Heard there was some trouble." His gaze flicked for a fraction of a second toward Rick, a look of such cold, dismissive contempt that Rick physically flinched. Preacher's eyes returned to Eleanor's. "Tommy's wife," he said, the words a solemn vow. "Doesn't have trouble. Not while we're still breathing." The name hung in the air. Tommy. The connection was made. The puzzle pieces began to click into place for the stunned onlookers. It was Mr. Chun, the store owner, who finally found his voice, bolstered by the sudden, overwhelming shift in power. His fear was burned away by a righteous indignation he had suppressed for too long. He came out from behind the counter, his small frame trembling not with fear, but with fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Eleanor. "This woman," he announced, his voice ringing with conviction, "is a hero. Do you hear me? A hero." He took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "She was a combat medic in the army. She ran into gunfire to save soldiers. She has a Silver Star for valor, one of the highest honors this country can give. She's seen more bravery in a single day than that piece of trash," he gestured venomously toward Rick, "has seen in his entire miserable life." He wasn't finished. His voice rose, filled with the passion of a truth finally spoken. "She was married to Sergeant Major Thomas Vance, a man who gave 30 years to this country, a legend, and after she lost him, she kept serving. She lost her legs on a patrol, saving a young private from a roadside bomb. She has sacrificed everything, and she asks for nothing. She lives on a small pension, comes in here for bread and soup, and never ever complains." He finally turned his full, unadulterated fury on Rick. "And you worthless coward, you dare to speak to her like that? You dare to touch her?" Mr. Chen's testimony, delivered with the force of a lifetime of quiet observation, landed like a series of hammer blows, shattering any lingering ambiguity about the scene that had unfolded. The truth about Eleanor Vance was now revealed, and it was more stunning than anyone could have imagined. Preacher slowly rose to his full, imposing height. He listened to Mr. Chen's words, his expression unchanging, as if the old man were merely confirming facts he already knew by heart. When Mr. Chen finished, a heavy silence returned to the store, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with awe and a profound, collective shame. Rick looked as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He was no longer just a bully who had picked on a weak victim. He was a ghoul who had desecrated a sacred monument. With emotion that was both practiced and deeply reverent, Preacher reached up and began to undo the front of his own leather vest. His cut. The leather was thick, worn soft in some places and scarred in others. It was a sacred object in his world, a tapestry of his life, his allegiance, his identity. On the back was the large, three-piece patch of the club, and on the front were dozens of smaller patches. Memorial patches for fallen brothers, road names, club positions, and military insignia from his own service. This was his armor, his flag, his soul worn on the outside. He slipped it from his massive shoulders. The room watched, holding its breath. He stepped toward Eleanor, who looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. He gently, carefully, draped the heavy vest over her small shoulders. It was absurdly large on her, swallowing her frame like a king's ceremonial robe. The iconic death's head patch rested between her shoulder blades. It was a mantle of honor, a public and unmistakable declaration. Preacher turned to face the room, his hand resting lightly on Eleanor's shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout, but it carried the weight of absolute authority, reaching every corner of the store and, it seemed, the entire block. "This patch," he said, his thumb tapping the leather on her shoulder, "means she is one of us. This vest means she is under the protection of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club." Forever, he let that sink in, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the onlookers, locking them in place. "That protection extends to this store," he continued, nodding toward Mr. Chan, who stood taller than he had in years. "And it extends to this entire block. If you see something, you say something. To us, this is our neighborhood now, and we take care of our own." Finally, his eyes settled on Rick. It was a look devoid of heat, of anger. It was something far colder, far more terrifying. It was the look of a man erasing another man from existence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet words he spoke next were the most chilling threat of all. "You're done here," Preacher said, his voice a low, flat monotone. "You will leave this store. You will go to your home, you will pack your things, and you will leave this town. We will not see your face here again. Not at this market. Not on this street. Not in this city. Am I understood?" It was not a question. It was a verdict. Rick, his face the color of wet concrete, could only manage a series of jerky, spastic nods, his eyes wide with a terror that went bone deep. He understood that this was not a threat of a beating. This was a promise of erasure. "Go," Preacher commanded, the single word a dismissal. Rick stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. He scrambled out of the store, not daring to look back, and disappeared down the street, a man running from his own ghost. The tension in the store broke, replaced by a quiet, purposeful energy. Two more bikers entered. One, a man with a patch that read Sarge, went directly to the aisle where Eleanor's milk had spilled. He knelt down, retrieved the loaf of bread from under the shelf, and then began methodically picking up the pieces of the burst carton. The other, a younger man, took the wire basket from Eleanor's lap, walked through the store, and began filling it with groceries. Fresh bread, milk, cans of thick stew, cheese, fruit, and a new can of tomato soup. He brought the overflowing basket to the counter and placed a thick roll of $100 bills in front of a stunned Mr. Chun. "For her," the biker grunted. "And for the store." Keep the change. They moved with an efficient, respectful solemnity, treating Eleanor not as a charity case, but as a revered elder, a matriarch who was finally receiving her due. The exodus from the market was not an escape, but a procession. The bikers parted, creating a wide, clear path from the door to the street. Sarge, having cleaned up the mess, gently took the handles of Eleanor's wheelchair. Preacher walked beside her, his hand never leaving her shoulder. As they emerged from the store into the fading afternoon light, the 150 men who had been waiting silently on their bikes began to stir. There was no command given, but as one, they swung their legs back over their machines and fired up their engines. The street erupted once again in a deafening, triumphant roar. But it was not an escort home. It was a parade. They didn't just follow her. They formed a rolling guard of honor. 2 bikers rode ahead, blocking off intersections. A dozen more formed a tight diamond formation around her, their bikes moving at a slow, deliberate walking pace to match Sarge's steps. The rest fell in behind, a massive, thundering river of steel that stretched for blocks. Windows and doors all along the street began to open. People came out onto their porches and front steps, drawn by the incredible noise and spectacle. They saw the legion of fearsome bikers, and at its heart, they saw the small woman in the wheelchair, the heavy, patched vest draped over her shoulders like a royal cloak. They saw the way the bikers moved around her, a perfect choreography of respect and protection. The community's transformation was now complete and absolute. They were not just seeing Eleanor Vance, the quiet, disabled woman from down the street. They were seeing a queen being escorted by her Praetorian guard. The whispers that had started in the market now spread from house to house. The story of what had happened, of her sacrifice, her past, her quiet heroism, and the incredible loyalty she commanded, traveled faster than the procession itself. Faces that had once held pity or indifference were now filled with a profound, unadulterated respect. They were witnessing the public correction of a cosmic injustice, and it was a humbling, awe-inspiring sight. They reached her small, modest house, with its peeling paint and a small, tidy garden in the front yard. The bikers arranged themselves along the street, lining both curbs, a silent, watchful legion standing guard. They cut their engines, and a peaceful quiet settled over the block, punctuated only by the chirping of birds and the gentle ticking of hot metal. Sarge carefully maneuvered Eleanor's chair up the small wooden ramp that led to her porch. Preacher helped the younger biker bring in the bags of groceries, setting them carefully on her kitchen table. When everything was done, they came back out to the porch where Eleanor sat, watching the sun finally break through the thick blanket of gray clouds, its golden rays illuminating the street. Preacher pulled up a rickety porch chair and sat beside her. He didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing that needed to be said. The shared history, the memory of Thomas, the unspoken code of loyalty, it filled the space between them. Finally, he reached into a saddlebag on a nearby bike and pulled out 2 cold bottles of water, handing one to her. Her gnarled fingers closed around the bottle. She looked out at the rows of motorcycles gleaming in the late afternoon sun, at the silent, patient men who had come for her. The heavy vest was still on her shoulders, a comforting, protective weight. The rumble of their arrival was gone, but the echo of it remained, a deep, resonant promise in her heart. It was the sound of brotherhood, the sound of honor, the sound of coming home. Eleanor Vance, the invisible woman, the forgotten hero, was finally seen. Her quiet dignity, the currency she had lived by her entire life, had been recognized and honored in the most public and powerful way imaginable. She was no longer alone, a solitary island of resilience. She was the heart of a tribe, the quiet center of a roaring, protective storm. And as the sun set, casting long shadows down the street, the silent presence of the bikers was a testament, a final, lingering image of dignity secured and a community transformed, forever watchful over their queen.